The wind moved slow across the green fields, carrying the smell of grass, steel, and something darker, war waiting to be born. Robb Stark sat tall on his horse, his wolf banner snapping behind him. He was young, but the North had already carved weight into his shoulders. Men looked at him not because he was Ned Stark's son, but because he had won battles men twice his age had lost. Still, today felt different. This enemy did not ride with banners or rules. This enemy came from stories whispered by sailors and frightened merchants. Across the wide field near the river, long ships rested like dark beasts pulled from the sea. Shields lined their sides, painted with symbols that mocked fear itself. At their front stood a man with wild eyes and a crooked smile, his hair braided, his beard thick with the promise of blood. Ragnar Lothbrok did not wear a crown, yet he stood like a king who did not need one. Robb studied him from afar. "That's him," he said quietly. "The Viking king." "Aye," said Rose Bolton beside him. "He doesn't fight like civilized men, no formations, no honor, only chaos." Robb frowned. "Then we adapt." Ragnar laughed loudly, the sound rolling across the field like thunder. He spoke to his men in a tongue harsh and sharp, then raised his axe high. His warriors beat their shields with weapons, a deep rhythm that made even seasoned northern soldiers shift uneasily. These men were not here for land alone. They were here for glory, for gods, for death itself. Ragnar stepped forward alone, stopping halfway between the armies. He spread his arms wide, as if welcoming fate. "King of the North!" he shouted in broken but confident common speech. "I am Ragnar, son of no king, chosen by the gods. Come, let us see which world deserves to live." Many of Robb's men murmured in anger. No proper challenge, no respect, just fire and madness. Robb nudged his horse forward a few steps, enough to be seen. "I am Robb Stark," he replied, his voice steady. "You stand on foreign land. Leave now, and I'll let your ships sail home." Ragnar tilted his head, amused. "Home?" He laughed again. "A man like me is always home on a battlefield." Robb felt the insult, but he did not rise to it. He had learned from his father that pride could kill faster than swords. Still, deep inside, doubt crept in. He knew battle tactics, supply lines, ambushes. But how do you fight men who want to die? Ragnar turned back to his army and lifted his axe again. The drumming stopped. Silence fell heavy. Robb raised his hand. Archers tensed. Cavalry waited. For a heartbeat, both worlds stood frozen. Game of Thrones against Vikings, order against chaos, discipline against hunger for blood. Then Ragnar dropped his axe forward. The Vikings charged screaming, not in lines but in a wild wave. Shields crashed together. The sound was like mountains breaking. Robb shouted commands and northern horns answered. Arrows darkened the sky, cutting down many Vikings, but they kept coming, stepping over their dead with smiles carved into their faces. Robb rode along his line, shouting, pointing, adjusting. His men trusted him. They held formation. Spears struck. Swords met axes. For a moment, it seemed strategy would win. Then Ragnar broke through. He moved like a storm given flesh, his axe splitting shields, his sword finding gaps no one else could see. He laughed as he fought, blood painting his arms, eyes shining as if the gods themselves whispered in his ears. Where he passed, northern soldiers fell, not because they were weak, but because fear followed him like a shadow. Robb saw it. He realized then this was not just a battle. This was belief versus belief. His men fought for banners and vows. Ragnar's men fought because death meant reward. Robb tightened his grip on his sword. "With me!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward toward the chaos. As he rode, one thought burned in his mind. If Ragnar Lothbrok is not stopped, the North will drown in blood. And somewhere between screams and steel, Ragnar looked up and smiled, because he had finally found a king worth killing. The clash grew louder as Robb pushed deeper into the fight. The world narrowed to mud, sweat, and the sharp ring of steel. His horse reared as an axe struck too close, and Robb leapt down, landing hard but steady. Around him, The northern line bent like a wall under too much pressure. These Vikings did not pull back when wounded. They leaned forward, biting through pain, dragging enemies down with them even as life left their bodies. Robb cut one man down, then another. His movements were clean, trained, controlled. Yet every time he struck, another Viking took the fallen man's place, screaming Ragnar's name as if it were a prayer. The sound crawled under Robb's skin. This was not how wars were meant to be fought. There was no pause, no fear of death, no sense of loss on their faces. A young northerner fell beside him, an axe buried in his chest. The boy's eyes were wide, confused, as if he did not understand why courage had not been enough. Robb swallowed hard and kept moving. Across the field, Ragnar climbed onto a broken shield pile, standing higher than the men around him. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye, but he did not wipe it away. He raised his arms again, shouting words Robb could not understand, but the meaning was clear. The Vikings roared back, renewed, their attack growing even more savage. "They follow him like he's a god," Robb muttered. Grey wind burst from the side, tearing into a Viking's throat. The direwolf moved like a nightmare, fast and silent, dragging men down, screaming. For a moment, the Vikings hesitated. Some stepped back, staring at the beast with awe instead of fear. Ragnar noticed. His laughter cut through the noise. He jumped down and walked straight toward Grey Wind, slow and fearless. The wolf snarled, teeth bared, muscles coiled to strike. Robb's heart pounded. "No," he whispered. Grey Wind lunged. Ragnar rolled aside at the last second, swinging his axe hard. The blade struck Grey Wind's shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but enough to draw a painful howl. Robb screamed and charged without thinking, shoving past men, slamming into Ragnar like a hammer. They fell together into the mud. For a second, the world went quiet. Ragnar grinned up at him, eyes bright with excitement. "So," he said between breaths, "the Wolf King shows his teeth." Robb struck first, punching Ragnar across the face. Ragnar laughed and headbutted him in return, stars bursting behind Robb's eyes. They rolled apart and stood, circling each other as the battle raged around them. It was as if an invisible space opened, soldiers instinctively pulling back, sensing something important was happening. "You fight well," Ragnar said, "but you fight to live." Robb raised his sword. "And you fight to die." "Yes," Ragnar replied calmly. "That is why my men will never run." They clashed again, sword against axe. Ragnar's strength was terrifying, every blow heavy enough to shatter bones. Robb relied on speed, turning strikes aside, stepping back, waiting for an opening. Mud sucked at their boots. Blood made the ground slick. Ragnar pressed forward relentlessly. "Your world is built on rules," he said as he attacked. "Mine is built on truth. The truth that one day all of this burns." Robb parried, his arms aching. "Then I'll make sure you burn with it." Ragnar roared and swung wildly. Robb ducked and drove his sword into Ragnar's side. The blade bit deep. For the first time, Ragnar staggered. The Vikings gasped. Ragnar looked down at the wound, then back at Robb. Slowly, almost lovingly, he placed his hand over the blood soaking his clothes. His smile widened. "Good," he said softly. "Very good." He kicked Robb hard in the chest, sending him crashing backward into the mud. Before Robb could rise, Ragnar tore the sword free from his own body and hurled it aside. Blood poured freely now, but Ragnar did not fall. Instead, he lifted his axe again. The Vikings began chanting, their voices shaking the air. The Northerners looked between Robb and Ragnar, unsure whether they were witnessing victory or something far worse. Robb pushed himself up, breath ragged, unarmed, his chest burning. He reached for a fallen spear, gripping it tightly. This was no longer about armies. This was about which kind of man the world would belong to. And as Ragnar stepped forward once more, wounded but unbroken, Robb realized with chilling clarity that killing him might not be enough to stop what he had unleashed. Robb held the spear with both hands, its wooden shaft slick with blood and rain. His arms trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Across from him, Ragnar stood hunched slightly now, one hand pressed to his wound, the other gripping his axe like it was part of his body. Blood dripped steadily into the mud, yet his eyes were sharp, alive, almost joyful. "Look at them," Ragnar said, nodding toward the men around them. "They watch us like children watching the gods argue." Robb glanced around. It was true. The fighting nearby had slowed, turned uneven. Northerners and Vikings alike were drawn toward them, caught by something heavier than orders. This duel was pulling the battle into its gravity. "End this," Robb said. "Call your men back." Ragnar shook his head slowly. "If I fall, they will fight harder. If you fall, your men will break." He smiled. "Either way, today becomes a story." Ragnar rushed him. Robb lowered the spear just in time. The point tore through Ragnar's side again, deeper this time, punching out through his back. The force stopped Ragnar mid-step. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The Vikings screamed in rage. Robb pushed harder, his teeth clenched, driving Ragnar back inch by inch. "Stay down," he growled. Ragnar looked down at the spear through his body, then up at Robb, his face twisted, not in pain, but in something close to pride. With a sudden roar, he grabbed the spear shaft with both hands and pulled himself forward along it, forcing the wound wider just to get closer. Robb's eyes widened in horror. Ragnar slammed his forehead into Robb's face. Bone cracked. Robb fell backward, losing the spear. Ragnar ripped it free of himself and snapped it in half like dry wood. He staggered, nearly falling, but stayed upright through pure will. Both men stood there breathing hard, faces swollen, blood-soaked, barely human anymore. Robb wiped blood from his eyes and drew a dagger. Ragnar lifted his axe again, though his arm shook now. The wound was finally winning. Around them, a horn blew from the northern line, 3 sharp blasts. Reinforcements were arriving. Heavy cavalry poured over the hill, banners snapping, fresh and disciplined. Ragnar heard it. His smile faded just a little. "Ah," he said quietly. "The tide turns." Robb lunged with the dagger. Ragnar tried to block, but his strength failed him at the last second. The blade slid under his ribs, deep and clean. Ragnar froze, staring down at it. For the first time, his knees buckled. Robb pulled the dagger free and stepped back, chest heaving. Ragnar fell to one knee, then the other. The chanting stopped. Vikings stared in disbelief. Some dropped their weapons. Others screamed and charged blindly, only to be cut down by the advancing Northmen. Ragnar looked up at Robb one last time. His voice was low now, almost calm. "You won today, Wolf King." Robb said nothing. "But remember this," Ragnar continued. "Men like me don't come from the sea alone. We come from hunger, from belief. Kill me, and another will rise." His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into the mud. For a long moment, Robb just stood there, staring at the body. He did not feel victory. He felt emptiness, like something wild and terrible had brushed past his world and left a scar. The Vikings began to retreat, some dragging bodies, others fleeing toward their ships. The North pressed forward, reclaiming the field. Cheers rose, but they sounded distant to Robb, muted, wrong. Grey Wind limped to his side, whining softly. Robb knelt and pressed his forehead to the wolf's, breathing him in, grounding himself. The battle was won. But Robb Stark knew something had changed. He had defeated Ragnar Lothbrok in flesh, but not in spirit. The idea of him would travel. Stories would spread across seas and kingdoms, and someday, someone would come chasing that legend. As Robb stood and looked toward the horizon, dark clouds gathered far away. The field was quiet now. In the strange way battlefields become quiet after they have taken everything they want. Bodies lay scattered like broken promises. The grass was crushed, torn, stained dark. Northern men moved among the fallen, helping the wounded, finishing the dying when mercy demanded it. The Vikings' longships were already pulling away from the shore, dark shapes shrinking into the gray distance. Robb walked slowly through it all, Grey Wind at his side. Every step felt heavier than the last. Men bowed their heads as he passed, calling him, "Your Grace, King in the North." but their voices felt far away. He had heard cheers before. He had tasted victory. This felt different. This felt like surviving something that should have killed him. Roose Bolton approached, his armor dented, his face unreadable as ever. "The enemy is retreating in full," he said. "Without their leader, they lost their madness." Robb nodded. "And without their madness, they were just men." Bolton hesitated. "What of the body?" Robb stopped. Ragnar's corpse still lay where it had fallen, eyes half open, face strangely peaceful. "Burn it," Robb said after a moment. "I don't want his kind worshipping him as a martyr." Bolton bowed slightly and turned away. As night fell, fires were lit across the field. The wounded groaned softly. Robb sat near one of the fires, his armor removed, his injuries cleaned as best as they could be. His face was swollen, ribs bruised, hands shaking now that the fight was over. Catelyn Stark arrived before midnight. She did not run to him. She walked slowly, as if afraid he might vanish if she moved too fast. When she reached him, she touched his face gently, then pulled him into an embrace. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I'm alive," Robb replied. "That seems to be enough these days." She looked into the fire. That man, he was dangerous in a way swords can't fix. Robb stared at the flames. He saw Ragnar's smile there. Yes, and men like him leave seeds behind. The next morning, smoke rose from the Viking pyre. Robb watched from a distance as Ragnar Lothbrok's body burned, flames climbing high, black smoke twisting into the sky like a warning. Some Vikings on distant ships beat their shields one last time, not in challenge, but in farewell. By the third day, ravens had already begun to fly. Stories spread faster than armies. They said the king in the north had slain a demon from the sea. Others said Robb had barely survived, that the Viking king laughed, even as he died. Some claimed Ragnar had prophesied Robb's fall with his last breath. None of them were entirely wrong. Weeks later, Robb stood in his war tent, staring at a map of the north. Reports came in from the coast, small raids, burned villages, not Ragnar's army, but men inspired by him, men who wanted to prove themselves worthy of the legend. "You killed the head," said the great John Umber, slamming his fist on the table, "but the beast still bites." Robb nodded slowly. "Then we change how we fight it." He ordered watchtowers along the coast, faster ravens, stronger fleets. He began thinking like Ragnar had, not to become him, but to anticipate him. Unpredictable strikes, traps instead of walls, fear turned back on itself. Yet at night, alone, Robb wondered. He dreamed of Ragnar standing at the edge of the world, smiling, blood running freely, eyes full of fire. In the dreams, Ragnar never attacked. He only watched, waiting. Robb woke one night drenched in sweat, gray wind growling softly at the darkness. "I beat you," Robb whispered into the shadows. But deep down, he knew the truth wars teach all kings eventually. Some victories follow you forever, and some enemies never truly die. Winter crept in early that year, sharp and unforgiving. Snow dusted the hills, then swallowed them whole. The north hardened the way it always did when the cold came. But beneath the surface, something restless moved. Robb felt it in the way men spoke more quietly, in how sentries stared longer into the dark, in how even gray wind paced at night like the world itself could not sleep. The raids grew bolder, not large armies, not open challenges, just sudden strikes. A fishing village burned before dawn. A watchtower went silent without warning. The attackers came from the sea and vanished back into it, leaving behind symbols carved into wood and stone. Not words, marks, runes. "They're copying him," said Mage Mormont as they studied the reports. "Ragnar made death into a banner. Now fools are marching under it." Robb rubbed his eyes. "They're not fools. They're desperate men chasing meaning." That frightened him more than numbers ever could. One night, a captured raider was brought before him. The man was thin, scarred, shaking from cold and fear. He did not beg. "Why do you follow him?" Robb asked quietly. The man lifted his head. "Because he showed us how to live without kneeling. Robb's jaw tightened. He's dead. The man smiled anyway. So are many gods. That smile haunted Robb long after the man was executed. The North held, but it bled slowly. Robb realized then what Ragnar had truly done. He had not come to conquer land. He had come to plant an idea, one that said kings could fall, that rules were lies, that chaos itself could be holy. And ideas were harder to kill than men. As months passed, whispers reached Robb of something worse. Across the narrow sea, Viking clans were gathering, not under one banner, but under many, each claiming to carry Ragnar's spirit, each leader calling himself the true heir of the legend. "They'll come," warned Galbart Glover, "not because you wronged them, but because you proved you were worthy." Robb looked out over the snow-covered fields beyond Winterfell's walls. "Then let them come." But the words felt heavier than before. Late one evening, Robb stood alone on the battlements. The wind howled, carrying the scent of ice and distant salt. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw a figure at the edge of the tree line, tall, still, watching. His hand went to his sword. The figure did not move. Then the wind shifted, and it was gone. Robb exhaled slowly. He was a king now, truly and fully. Not because he wore a crown, but because he understood the cost. He had faced a man who feared nothing, and in doing so, learned that the world would always create more like him. The lesson burned deep. Robb Stark would not rule through fear. He would rule through readiness. Because somewhere beyond the sea, beyond the snow, beyond the stories, men were sharpening axes and telling children about a laughing Viking king who died standing. And they were teaching those children one dangerous truth, that even kings can bleed. The first true test came at sea. Robb had never trusted the water. The North was stone, snow, and steel, honest things. The sea lied. It hid enemies, carried them where walls could not stop them, and returned them when least expected. Still, he had learned from Ragnar's shadow. If the threat came from the waves, then the answer had to meet it there. The northern fleet was small, rebuilt in haste, crewed by men more used to horses than oars. They sailed under gray skies, cutting through dark water toward a cluster of islands where scouts reported Viking banners gathering. Robb stood at the prow of the lead ship, cloak snapping behind him, eyes fixed forward. He did not feel brave. He felt responsible. The first longship appeared at dawn, then another, then many more, dark shapes sliding out of fog like predators. These were not Ragnar's men. They wore different colors, different symbols, but their smiles were the same. "Signal the line," Robb ordered. "Hold formation." The Vikings charged without hesitation. The clash at sea was chaos made worse by fire. Flaming arrows screamed through the air. Ships crashed together. Men fought on decks slick with blood and salt water. Robb boarded an enemy ship himself, sword in hand, shouting commands as his men followed. This time there was no single leader to strike down. That was the real horror. They fought one group back, only to be hit from the side by another. Every victory was answered by fresh attackers, each screaming Ragnar's name like a curse and a blessing both. Robb realized then what Ragnar's last truth had been. Kill the man, and the legend multiplies. Hours later, the sea was littered with wreckage and bodies. The North held, but barely. As the surviving Viking ships pulled back, Robb leaned on his sword, breathing hard, staring at the water. This was not a war with an end. Back at Winterfell, the mood was grim. The small council argued. Some urged retreat from the coasts, others demanded harsher punishment, burned villages, fear used as a weapon. Robb listened, silent. At last, he spoke. Ragnar ruled by giving men something to believe in. Fear alone won't stop that. They looked at him, confused. "We give them something stronger," Robb continued. "A future." The room went quiet. Robb began sending messages, not threats, but offers. Trade, land, protection for those who laid down arms. He welcomed defectors, even former raiders, putting them to work, rebuilding what they had destroyed. Many lords hated it. Some called it weakness. But slowly, it worked. Not all Vikings wanted endless war. Some were tired. Some had followed Ragnar because he promised meaning. Robb offered something different: stability, respect, a place to stand without drowning the world in blood. Still, resistance remained. One night, a blade missed his throat by inches. The assassin died screaming, but the message was clear. Ragnar's believers would never accept peace. Robb stood afterward in his chamber, staring at his reflection. He looked older than his years now. Harder. "I won't become him," he said aloud, as if Ragnar might be listening. "But I won't ignore you either." Outside, the wind howled across the north, carrying old stories and new ones together. And somewhere far away, men still spoke of a wolf king who killed a god and lived with the consequences. The war did not end with a great final battle. It faded instead, slowly and painfully, like a wound that refuses to close. Years passed. Robb Stark grew into his crown the hard way. His hair darkened with streaks of gray far too early. The fire in his eyes softened, not into weakness, but into something steadier. He no longer chased victory. He managed survival. The North adapted. Coastal towns were rebuilt stronger. Mixed crews sailed the seas now, Northmen and former raiders side by side, bound by shared profit instead of shared bloodlust. Children who once heard only stories of Ragnar the Fearless now heard another name spoken just as often: Robb the Unbroken. Still, some nights were worse than others. On one such night, Robb rode alone beyond Winterfell's walls, gray wind padding beside him through the snow. The sky was clear, stars sharp as knives. He stopped on a hill overlooking the land he had bled for. He thought of the boy who had fallen beside him on the battlefield, of the Viking who smiled as he died, of the moment he realized that killing a man was easy compared to killing what that man stood for. Was it worth it? Robb asked the cold air. There was no answer. There never was. At dawn, a raven arrived from the coast. No raid, no attack, just a report. The last known Ragnar-worshipping clan had splintered. Some settled. Some vanished into history. Some turned their backs on the sea entirely. The legend was finally starving. Robb closed his eyes and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in years. He was not celebrated in songs the way Ragnar had been. No drunken poets screamed his name in smoky halls. His story was quieter. He kept people alive. He built instead of burned. He endured. And endurance, he had learned, was the hardest victory of all. One evening, long after the fires of war had gone cold, Robb stood in the great hall of Winterfell, watching children run between the tables, laughing. A former Viking sailor lifted a cup beside a northern lord, both men arguing over nothing important at all. Peace looked fragile, but it was real. Robb rested a hand on Grey Wind's head and allowed himself a rare smile. Ragnar Lothbrok had come like a storm. Robb Stark remained like the land itself. The North remembered winters, not men. When Robb Stark finally felt the weight lift, it did not come with trumpets or omens. It came quietly, on an ordinary morning, when no ravens brought bad news and no horns sounded from the coast. The world simply held. He was older now, not old in years, but in memory. His body still carried the marks, an ache in his ribs when the cold was deep, a stiffness in his left hand where Ragnar's axe had nearly shattered bone. Those pains reminded him he had survived something that was never meant to be clean or heroic. One afternoon, Robb walked alone to the Godswood. The heart tree stood silent as it always had, red leaves drifting down like drops of frozen blood. He placed a hand against its pale bark and closed his eyes.